In this video, we're going to create the style class.
Okay, now what is this class and why do we need it?
This class is the code and field representation of the style system. If you remember, style is going to include things like textures and fonts, as well as visual positioning information.
Okay, well that tells us why we need it too.
The purpose of this class is to store any fields that might represent things like fonts and textures, as well as to provide texture loading functionality.
Okay, so it's more than just a holder, it's actually going to do stuff too.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, the implementation we'll put together in this video will be added to in later videos, because certain aspects of the style system will indeed be configurable.
Alright.
To get things started, let's jump right into our project and add in the style class. We'll go down here to Game, and we'll add a new class. This class will be called Style. And we'll take off our sub namespace. Style itself is going to be a static class. And we're going to need a few using statements. We'll jump in here first with some references to the XNA namespace. So, using Microsoft.xna.framework. We'll also be needing XNA framework graphics, as well as content. One last thing we'll need is we are going to be working a little bit with paths inside of this class.
So you need system.io.
So we're also going to add system.io to gain access to that very useful path.combine function.
Gotcha.
Alright, now we can turn our attention to the class itself. And we're going to begin with a series of fields. The first of which will be the font fields. Now, another thing to note is this class shares some similarities to the global state class in that several other classes are going to be looking back at style. Things that need to leverage textures or positioning information are all going to be meant to look at style.
Right, but it wouldn't do to put it inside the global state because this is something that may change based on a config file.
And not just that, but looking at it, just in this class alone, we have a fair few fields to cover.
Yeah.
And we're going to be adding fields to global state. So at this point, it's also for organizational purposes.
Yeah.
The idea is that style is visual stuff.
Sure.
Global state is inner workings of the game.
Yeah, gut stuff that you don't necessarily want to play with.
Alrighty, so the implication of that a lot of other classes are going to be looking here, is that we're going to have a lot of public fields. So to begin with the fonts, we'll drop down a public static field of type sprite font, and we'll call this font small. Then I'll jump back over here. I'll use copy and paste to duplicate the line. We'll make a second sprite font field called font large. Alright, moving on, we need to also hold a series of textures. If you remember from some of the texture assets we brought in to the game, we have things like a hit effect, a note texture, and a staff background. So we're going to need fields to be able to reference those throughout the game. So we'll jump down here and we'll begin with some texture fields. Again, these will be public static fields, and they will be of type texture 2D. The first is going to be called fill texture. And we'll use copy and paste. We'll duplicate these a few times, actually 3 additional times, so we have 4 fields to fill out here. The next texture field will be note texture, followed by effect texture, and the final texture field will be staff texture.
Now, at this point, you're not going to be setting up any textures for the screens right now.
That's right. The actual screen backgrounds are going to be handled as individual screens are loaded.
Okay.
There's also some naming association that's going to happen so that a specific screen will be able to find and know what background it's supposed to use.
All right.
Now, some of the loading functionality in the style class is what's going to be leveraged by the screen system.
Sure.
But the actual textures themselves will come into play as screens get created later on down the road.
I just noticed there was a big stack of PNGs there we were kind of overlooking. Just wanted to make sure I brought it up.
Exactly. We're setting up things here that are going to be loaded for every other class in the game to use.
Okay.
And the screens will get into specific screen elements. All right, now we can move on to a handful of methods that are going to be inside of the style class. Primarily, these are going to be initialize and load texture. So let's get these dropped in. And in the creation of our textures, one interesting thing to note is we had just been talking about loading textures later when screen comes around. We're going to be utilizing these texture assets, which means we will need a content manager to access such assets.
Yeah.
And since we're going to be loading them at an undetermined point down the road, we'll need to hold on to a reference of the game's content manager. Of course, over here in game, we have this wonderful content manager instance. We can use that to load whatever we want. But over here in style, we need some way of looking at this guy.
Tapping into that, yeah.
So we're going to actually hold on to a reference of that content manager ourselves. So that means here as a style class, we're going to make another field a static content manager, and we'll simply call that content.
Gotcha. Okay.
Now we're going to create an initialization method for style, and this will be used to set up some of our textures, load in other textures, and also remember that reference to content so that our dynamic texture loading methods can function later in time. So let's drop this method in place. It's going to be a public method. It will, of course, be static, and the name will be initialize.
Now, is this also going to be a void?
As a matter of fact, yes, initialize is not going to be returning anything, so we'll drop in a return type of void here. All right, we're going to need a few parameters. First, we're going to take in a graphics device as well as a content manager. The reason we're taking in a graphics device is the fill texture is going to be created procedurally rather than loaded as an asset, and we'll need to be able to access the graphics device to do so. So we'll bring in a graphics device as a parameter called graphics, and a content manager, which we'll simply bring in as content. Now, right off the bat, we'll go ahead and store a reference to that content manager. So we'll say style.content. You will notice that I named the parameter the same as the field. So if you just type out content, in this sense, content is going to be the parameter.
Right.
So to gain access to the content field, we're going to have to address it through the name style. So we'll actually address ourselves as the class.
Style.content.
So style.content is something different than the parameter content.
Okay.
As we can see proven with IntelliSense here, that is style.content, that is the parameter content. Alright, moving on from here, let's get all of our textures set up. Let's begin with the fill texture. If you remember to the music engine demo, we used a technique where we created a data array containing a single white pixel, and that's the data source we used to set the actual field.
Right, we just stretched that out afterward.
So let's begin with fill texture. So style.fillTexture we will set to be equal to a new instance of texture. We'll pass in the graphics device that was passed to us in initialize, and we'll specify that this texture will have dimensions of 1 pixel by 1 pixel. Then we'll turn around and we'll call setData. So style.fillTexture.setData. We'll specify that data as the type of color, and we need to pass in a color array. So we'll simply create a color array in line here in this function call. So we'll create a new color array, and we will specify the actual data here in a curly brace, and that one piece of data will be color.white.
Gotcha. This looks like it's, again, that system of taking more or less 3 lines of code and squashing them down to 1.
Exactly. Make an array, assign that array element, but do so within the construction of the array, and then immediately drop that construction of the array directly into our setData call.
Nice.
All right. The next field we need to address is our note texture. So we'll take style.note texture. And for this one, since it is listed here as an asset, we'll simply load it using the content manager. So we've been passed in a content manager. We'll use that content manager to load a texture 2D, and the actual asset name will be given by our full path information. So here's where we need to take all the path into account.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're going to do is we'll take path.combine, and we'll drop in style path, which is found in global state, and we'll combine that with the asset name font underscore, or excuse me, note.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not font.
And looking at it, there is, thinking about it, since content already knows what the path is, we probably don't even need to go through all of that.
Kind of going a little far.
Just looking at it, we'll try it without, because once again, this should be maintained by the content manager itself. Right. So we'll let it handle it. If we need to, of course, we can come in here. If we turn out to not need it, we can probably just pull out the path IO reference.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll get to that as we need to. So once again, the idea is simply to get that node asset over into the note texture field. And we can duplicate this line a few times. We also need the effect texture and the staff texture. So effect texture will be effect, and the note texture, or excuse me,
the staff
texture will be staff. Alright, that should take care of our textures. Now we also need to load in the fonts. So again, we can look at things like style.font small and font large. We'll use the content manager to load those as well.
Mm-hmm.
So content.load will load the type of sprite font. And the asset name will be font small. Now we can just take this line, duplicate it, and use the same kind of call for loading font large. And that should take care of loading.
Gotcha.
Again, a lot of typing to do some simple content loading. But again, we have a handful of assets, so we need to get those all loaded and ready for use.
Mm-hmm.
All right, moving on, we have another method to address, and that is the load texture method. And again, this is going to be used in case some other system down the road needs to gain access to any other assets that may exist, but ones that we don't want to explicitly load and name at this point. So what we're going to do is we'll make a method, call it public static load, or excuse me, the return type on this will actually be texture 2D, since the idea is to call the method and get a texture back.
Okay.
So the name will be load texture, and the method signature will be the path to load from, and the actual asset name of the texture. So we'll take in a second string for asset name. Now, before we accomplish the load, we'll simply combine path and asset name, and then return a texture using that name. So we'll say string full path is equal to path.combine, and we'll take in path and the asset name fields, and that gives us a full path. Now we'll simply return
whatever your texture is.
Exactly. So return content.load texture 2D and we'll take in full path as the asset name. And again, the reason for combining these like such is we have everything held here under the style subfolder, so we may need to specify exactly where these come in from. Now, one more thing we'll do is we will actually add an overload to the load texture method, giving one that does just that, since as far as we're concerned at this point in the game, everything exists under style.
Right.
So we'll create an overload that assumes everything is placed under the style path. So we'll make an overload, public static load texture, where we'll just take in an asset name. And we need to specify a return type, which will be texture 2D. And here, we'll simply make a call to our main load texture. So I'll simply return the result of load texture, assuming the style path. And of course, over in global state, we have the style path, and we'll combine that with the asset name, or rather the call to load texture will combine both of those in return.
Okay.
So the idea is that you can specify an arbitrary path to load an asset from, or you can have load texture also assume that
it's going to be in the style path.
Exactly. It'll assume style path if no path is provided.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
All right. That takes care of the style class itself. We'll build to make sure that it contains no syntax errors.
So it's just some fields and the ability to load in some textures when the game starts.
Yep. So we'll go jump over here to the game class, and we'll jump down to the load content method, and we'll make sure that our style class gets initialized. So we'll say style dot initialize. We need to pass in a graphics device. So that's available here as a field inside of game.
As well as the content manager?
Yep. Which is held in the field content. And it takes care of style initialization. Now, one thing to point out, just one point of cleanup that we need to address, is the fact that since we were creating this fill texture ourselves, meaning the content manager has no idea this fill texture exists, we need to make sure that we explicitly let go of it ourselves.
All right.
So over here in unload content, we'll take our style.fill texture, and we'll make sure to dispose it.
Okay.
Because again, the content manager, as well as being able to load content, is of course responsible for cleaning any of it up when the game gets unloaded. But since we created the fill texture outside of the content manager, we'll make sure we do that ourselves here.
Gotcha.
And one more build, make sure that everything gets saved. Everything is working, no syntax errors. We can run the game, though it doesn't load anything.
Yeah.
Actually, it's a good thing we tested this.
Uh-oh.
You'll notice that we are getting some content load exceptions, and the relative paths, and this does make sense too, because thinking about it, content has a root directory of simply ending in content. We're in style. So that means we do need to do some path combining to put all these together.
Okay.
You know, I almost like doing this better because it's easier to read this. This line is going to get, of course, significantly longer after we put in the path combine call. So it's easy here to see the assets that get loaded, though in reality we need to add some path information to them.
I see what you're saying.
Of course, we can do that with path.combine, and we already have style path in global state. So we'll simply combine style path with note. We'll put a closing parenthesis for that call to combine, and then that should wrap everything up nicely. If we try to run these other load statements, we'll still throw exceptions, but we can see that we successfully got past note texture. We can even see that it's 48 by 15 pixels, indicating that it did, in fact, load successfully.
Cool.
So now let's grab part of this statement, starting with path.combine right up until the comma. We'll copy that block of code so that we can paste the call in before effect, before staff. Of course, we need an additional parenthesis to finish these off. And I imagine we'll have the same problem with our font loading.
Yeah.
Of course we do. So once again, paste up to that last comma and space, and then a closing parenthesis. And there we
There
are.
you go.
Everything has loaded successfully. We have our full path resolution in place, and we have some additional methods that can be used later as things need to dynamically load textures.
Gotcha. So with that, our style class is done, and we're ready to move on to the next part of our code.